Well, after the massive success of my first video, meaning that it currently has 6 views and I have 1 subscriber, I figured that was sufficient motivation to make a second video. This time I have a few questions to ask liberals. This video is similar to my first video in that it's basically intended to counter some common left-wing arguments, but these are actual questions that you can pose in order to get your left-wing friends thinking. The first question is, quite simply, what is the definition of theft? This is a good question to ask because it's an easy first metric on whether or not this person will be easy to convince of the truth. So what is it then? Well, it's simply the removal of property belonging to someone else without the permission of the owner, and not in retaliation for some previous act of aggression. Why ask this? Because nowhere in this definition does it say anything about what is done afterwards with the property. If you watched my last video, I pointed out that liberals just love to name drop logical fallacies to make themselves look smart. So when they claim that taxation is not theft because you are given something afterwards, tell them that that is an appeal to consequences. If you want to argue that it is justifiable theft, then that is a completely different argument. And if you want to argue that you implicitly consent to taxation by living in this country, well, our next question is, does consent have to be explicit? I am sure that you have heard leftists say this before. California Senate Bill 967, the infamous yes means yes law, authored by Kevin Gosgon de Leon, says the following, and the full text is in the description. In order to receive state funds for student financial assistance, the governing board of each community college district, the trustees of the California State University, the regents of the University of California, and the governing boards of independent post-secondary institutions shall adopt a policy concerning sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking, as defined in the Federal Higher Education Act of 1965, involving a student both on and off campus. The policy shall include all of the following. 1. An affirmative consent standard in the determination of whether consent was given by both parties to sexual activity. Affirmative consent means conscious and voluntary agreement to engage in sexual activity. It is the responsibility of each person involved in the sexual activity to ensure that he or she has the affirmative consent of the other or others to engage in the sexual activity. Lack of protest or resistance does not mean consent, nor does silence mean consent. Affirmative consent must be ongoing throughout a sexual activity and can be revoked at any time. The existence of a dating relationship between the persons involved or the fact of past sexual relations between them should never by itself be assumed to be an indicator of consent. Interesting, right? Note that it even says lack of protest or resistance does not mean consent, nor does silence mean consent. So any leftist who supported this bill logically cannot use that argument that by continuing to live here, you consent to obey the government, right? Or does consent only have to be explicit when genitalia is involved? Anyway, back to taxes. Fine free. In context, you can ask this when discussing healthcare, as leftists will almost invariably say that we need free healthcare, like they have in Canada, the UK, etc. Or if they're really bold, they'll say that we need free healthcare, like every other developed nation. Just get them to define free. If you point out that it isn't free, and I personally am a fan of sarcastically acting amazed that doctors in other countries are all volunteers and all of their medical supplies have just been magically conjured into existence, but if you point out that it isn't free, they'll inevitably respond with, well, it's free at the point of service. Well, yes, literally everything in existence is free once you've already paid for it. That's like claiming McDonald's should be free at the point of service. Literally all they're saying is, I want to pay now rather than when I need it, and I think everybody else should be forced to as well. Which is an actual argument, albeit a shitty one, but a real argument. All I am aiming to accomplish with this question is to stop this newspeak of calling things which clearly aren't free. Ask them if they would support the government no longer respecting the right to a fair trial if it meant that American lives would be saved. You can also change that to any other right that you wish, as long as it is not the right to self-defense / the right to keep and bear arms, as this question is intended to counter that. I always hear them saying that it's okay to limit this right because it means so many lives will be saved. If you can at least get them to admit that they don't think people have a right to keep and bear arms, which again I will use interchangeably with the right to self-defense, then you've at least made them consistent. I suppose that, along with this question, you could ask, how much can a right be limited before that right is violated? The correct answer is not at all, but it's up to you to get them to say that. Along with that, we have, does the First Amendment protect the internet? This question is pretty simple, and you ask this question whenever they claim that the Second Amendment doesn't protect quote-unquote assault weapons, because the Founding Fathers could have never imagined such scary, high-capacity black killing machines with barrel shrouds, which is the thing that goes up. You may have noticed a pattern with these last two slides, which is basically trying to show that most liberals are inconsistent in their treatment of self-defense as a right. There are a million other questions you could ask to do this, like, do you support free speech licenses and background checks? Or ask them to explain the difference between violating Second Amendment rights and violating the First Amendment rights of Muslims to practice their religion. Basically, any argument that leftists use to violate the right to keep and bear arms can be applied to all other rights. I think that is enough for my second video. I am not quite sure yet what I will do for my third video, though I am leaning towards discussing some particular news story. Though rest assured, I will always make these videos on leftist rhetoric, whether people watch them or not. As always, feel free to leave suggestions, and thanks for watching.